From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead for you today, K-State's Mike Stamm will reflect on this past canola production season in Kansas, what was learned about the importance of planting dates. He'll also look at some of the standout varieties in the 2018 field trials. Then K-State's Mykel Taylor will talk about a new survey of Kansas landlords and tenants on how they handle conservation decisions in their farmland leasing arrangements. Those findings will be presented at the upcoming Risk and Profit Conference at K-State. And further ahead, for this week's K-State Horticulture segment, Raymond Cloyd talks about dealing with a host of insect problems in lawns and gardens right now, including a trio of damaging beetles. Right here on this Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
We're glad to have you aboard for this Agriculture Today. Another canola production season is in the books here in Kansas and the Central Plains. Again, this crop continues to carve out a bigger niche in our cropping systems in this region. And just how did the 2018 canola harvest go, and what have we learned from this latest experience? We'll talk about those and other items now with K-State canola breeder Mike Stamm. Mike, so many years we see canola production somewhat parallel that of wheat, since they are obviously planted at the same time, follow basically the same growing season. Was that the case this year?
Yeah, Eric, you could say that the canola season really mimicked what we saw in wheat this year. You know, a lot of the same challenges for the wheat crop. We faced those same ones with canola, and it really started back last fall when we had dry conditions at planting, and that kind of delayed us in getting started, and so that kind of set the crop back in its start. So we had small plants going into the winter, and then we had a dry fall, dry winter, and some colder temperatures come through. And when you have small canola, dry conditions, and those bitterly cold temperatures, we tend to see some winter kill, and we also see some physical damage to the plants, particularly the crown, and so that towards the end of maturity, you start to see issues with lodging because plants have weak stems. And that certainly caused some problems with the crop this year and hurt our yields. And so yields were down, looking at previous years. However, I would say yields were a little bit better than what we expected.
Is there a specific figure you'd talk about in terms of average yields?
Average yields for the state of Kansas are typically in the upper 30s to 40 bushel to the acre. And this year at our trial sites that we harvested, we were looking at yields in the upper 20s to low 30s where conditions were very challenging. And then we were seeing yields where conditions were a little bit better, pushing 30 to 40 bushels. So I was pretty pleased with how the results turned out this year. And, it kind of goes to show that canola is quite a resilient crop.
And for the record, at how many sites did you conduct variety performance tests on canola?
We had 8 locations here in the state this year, and 4 of those locations were harvest. The 4 that were lost, again, it goes back to last fall. We just had dry conditions, and we had 1 location that blew out because the plants were small, and we had a lot of wind and dry soil blowing back and forth, and so we lost the Hutchison location because of that. We lost Belleville this past year because, again, establishment was poor, and then the bitterly cold temperatures we had over the winter basically took that plot out. The 2 that we harvested, my program specifically, was Norwich and Manhattan, and then 2 of our collaborators, one at Colby and one at Garden City, also harvested their variety trials. Now, the 2 plots at Colby and Garden City, they had some hail damage with summer thunderstorms that we've had here recently, and so yields are going to be down at those 2 locations. But the Norwich and Manhattan location actually produced some pretty good yields.
And always looking for a silver lining here, you mentioned that cold temperatures took their toll in December and early January. On the other hand, if you try to accentuate the positive, it did give a hint as to the ability of various varieties to endure winter kill.
It's in those years where we have the challenging winters and those below zero temperatures where we get an opportunity to screen our germplasm for winter survivability. And this past year, we got some excellent notes on those variety trials that did succeed, and then through our breeding nurseries here in Manhattan. And so, we take advantage of what conditions we get, and this year we were able to kind of add to that database of information that we have on winter survivability in canola.
We do want to talk more, Mike, here about variety performance and some of the data that's out there. When you look at management practices this past year, again, with all this adversity going on, did we learn anything about things that producers can do to make canola more viable?
I think the thing that producers really need to focus on is kind of taking advantage of the conditions that they have in the fall for planting and not waiting too late to plant the crop. I know that's really hard to do in some years, and last year was probably one of the most challenging years for establishment of the crop. And so what my recommendation is moving forward on planting date is if conditions look favorable earlier in that planting window, probably take advantage of that soil moisture if it's there early in the planting window and get the crop in so it is established and it's able to get the adequate amount of top growth that it needs to get through the winter.
You look through the sites that did render results on yield performance. Any varieties that leap to mind as standouts?
There certainly are, and with having the breeding program here at Kansas State, we're one of the only winter canola breeding programs in the U.S., and so we've got an opportunity to bring some adapted genetics to the market. One of the varieties that I'm pretty excited about that we released last year in 2017, the name of that variety is Surefire, and Surefire is tolerant to the sulfonylurea herbicide that's left over in the soil. We often use sulfonylurea herbicides in wheat production, and they have plant-back restrictions for canola oftentimes. And so by planting Surefire, producers can avoid those plant-back restrictions when they rotate to canola following wheat. So Surefire at our Norwich location, it was one of the higher yielding varieties, and it was also the highest yielding variety here in Manhattan. And Surefire is a replacement to our variety Sumner, which is also tolerant to the SU herbicide residual in the soil. Sumner has been around for a lot of years, and so we're excited to bring something to the market to replace Sumner. Surefire has really high top-end yield. It's also a bit later than Sumner, and typically our later maturing varieties oftentimes have that higher yield potential, and so it's certainly one to keep an eye on.
And you've several other names, though, from the other locations as well that did perform admirably, right?
Right. One of those varieties that we're particularly interested in and will be available for the first time this fall is a Roundup Ready variety by the name of CP320W, which is marketed by Cropland Genetics. Looking beyond the Kansas data, CP320 actually had a really good year in Oklahoma. At 3 of the variety trial locations, it was the top yielding Roundup Ready variety. And so we're very excited about this particular variety because it is on the earlier side of maturity. It's Roundup Ready, but it's also very winter hardy. We think it's probably the most winter hardy Roundup Ready canola variety out there. Mm-hmm. And so we're excited about its place here in the Southern Great Plains. Again, speaking about winter hardiness, there is another variety that we released in 2016, that's a conventional by the name of Torrington. Torrington is being marketed by Oldie's Seed Farms here in Kansas. And Torrington did very well at both the Manhattan and Norwich trials this year, and it will be available for the first time this fall as well. And so we're excited at the level of winter hardiness that Torrington is going to bring to the market as well.
And these are just a few examples of the numerous varieties that are listed in the 2018 National Winter Canola Variety Trial. So you would urge producers to have a look at the full lineup and make some assessments for themselves, right?
That's right. There were about 37 varieties that we tested last year in the national trial, and around 20 of those are commercially available. So like we've said before, there are a lot of options at this stage in the game. You know, when I started working with canola now, I guess 13 years ago, we had 4 or 5 options. And so we've quadrupled that now, and I think that's great for growers that want to grow this crop.
I have to ask you, while we're on the topic of varieties, anything new coming down the line from the canola development program here at K-State, Mike?
You know, we've had a really good run here the last 2 to 3 years. We've released 5 varieties now that I think have a really good fit for the southern Great Plains. And we mentioned winter hardiness, and that's always going to be extremely important. New blackleg tolerance as well, which blackleg, of course, is the disease that we're most concerned about here in the southern Great Plains. We're bringing up for increase a variety this year that's Roundup Ready that looks to have one of the higher oil contents of any of the current Roundup Ready products that are out there. So we're going to continue to focus on oil because that's, you know, number one trait for canola as well.
So we'll be looking for those new arrivals as they come out of the program. But for now, where can producers go to read up on variety performance numbers as you've collected them?
We'll continue to put information in the agronomy e-updates, and people can always go to the KSRE website, search for National Canola Variety Trial, and you can pull up multiple years of data for a lot of these varieties now. And I always want to make that point to really think about looking at more than 1 year's data when choosing a canola variety. I think that's extremely important because, as we talked about earlier, our years are different.
And as you say, there is information in the e-update newsletter series out of agronomy. The issue this past Friday, July the 13th, has a full write-up on canola yields in Kansas here for the 18 crop. And we'll have you back soon and cover some of the finer points of enhancing one's planting success with canola here in Kansas.
I'd be happy to do that.
We appreciate the update right here. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Canola breeder, K-State's Department of Agronomy, that's Mike Stamm. We'll be back with more on this, Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today, 800-321-3276, or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and welcome back. We'll feature here on this segment a topic that will be addressed in full at that Risk and Profit Conference that K-State Agricultural Economics will be hosting less than a month from now, August 16th and 17th to be precise. This particular breakout session will cover a quite unique and in-depth producer-tenant survey, and looking at land leases and some of the thinking that goes into those between the two parties. Mykel Taylor is with us, agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension. She partnered up with a graduate researcher here at K-State, Allison Pitts, on this project. What prompted this effort, Mykel?
Well, what we wanted to do was learn more about the interaction between landowners and tenants when it came to conservation practices. And it can be a little bit of a challenge when we start to think about how farmers make decisions about the conservation practices that they employ. It's pretty straightforward for them on owned land that they know what they want to do, and they'll own it long enough to reap the benefits of conservation practices that they employ. It's a different question, though, when you start to talk about leased land, because what you do on that, number one, you only lease it for a certain number of years at a time, and so some of those long-term benefits you may or may not receive, and also just trying to interact with that landowner and understanding what they want and what they're interested in as far as conservation practices. So it's an interesting dynamic, and we wanted to learn more about it, and so we did it through a survey.
And we want to describe the survey tool in just a moment, but this breakout session at Risk and Profit Conference is entitled The Value of Social Capital in Farmland Leasing Relationships. What is meant in this context by social capital?
Well, social capital is the trust that we build up between two people who do business together. And what we find is that the better the relationship, the better the trust, or the more trust that's built up between them, it will actually affect the terms of the lease. So an example might be that we get to a point where if I'm a landowner and you're a tenant, I've observed you taking care of my land and you've done it year after year, and I might give you a discount on the lease in order to sort of compensate you for being a trustworthy tenant. So social capital in this context is really just understanding what's built up in the relationship between the landowners and the tenants and how that's affecting the lease itself.
And measuring that social capital, that led you and Allison to work very diligently on coming up with a survey tool that captures that.
Right, because when you start talking about conservation practices or, a tenant coming to a landowner and saying, I want to do these new things and I think that they're important, the more trust, the more social capital that you have in that relationship, the more likely that that's going to turn out to be a positive outcome, because the tenant will sort of have the trust that the landowner is going to support them and be there and let them rent that land for enough years to capture some of the benefits of that conservation practice.
The extent of this effort, how many producers did you reach out to and how did you go about it?
So we reached out to every member of the Kansas Farm Management Association and sent them surveys asking them to answer questions about their largest lease that they operate. And that was how we got the tenant information. And then we also sent along an extra survey, a blank survey, that we asked them to send to their landowner of that lease. And so the idea being that we would get back matched pairs of survey responses from a tenant and a landowner, asking them both the same questions and seeing what kind of responses we got from them.
You wanted to see how much uniformity in responses.
Sure, yeah. If they're coming at this from the same philosophy or if they have different ideas about how these things should work.
And you got a decent response to the surveys, it sounds.
Yeah, we got back about a 30% response rate, which is really quite good for a survey.
We won't go through the entire point-by-point survey, but just an idea of what you were asking there. Environmental practices, who's making the decisions, that was a key component here, right?
Right. We were asking about different programs that they might be involved in, like CRP, CSP, and EQIP. And then we were asking them about different conservation practices that they might do on land that they own and land that they lease. So it could be anything from cover crops to no-till to wildlife habitat, filter strips, all kinds of things like that. So we tried to cover the gamut of things that we thought that they might be doing.
You got into the mechanics of leases as well to some extent. What kinds of leases, how decisions are made, generally speaking, for cropland?
Right. We're always interested in knowing just a little bit more about how leases are set up and what kinds of factors impact how those leases are set up and the rental rates that they set. So we ask questions about the size of the lease, what kinds of crops are being grown on it, how far that leased ground is away from an operator's home base. We ask questions about the landlord, whether or not they live nearby or if they're a retired farmer or if they have ever had any farming experience or not. So we just ask some of those basic questions about the lease and about the landowner just to get a good idea of what kind of information that we have about those leases. The other real key question that we asked was how often they communicate with their landowner. Mm-hmm. And, the underlying issue here is communication and how they're communicating between the landowner and tenant. Specifically in our study, we were looking at conservation and the use of conservation practices, but just general communication is also a factor there.
Back to the conservation component here, which is a major part of this. Did you sense, although you're still compiling the results, some trends or common threads here as you saw the responses?
Well, one of the things that we suspect might be an issue is just this whole idea of who we're leasing from. And so we know that there's a pretty big chunk of the landowner population that are not farmers themselves, have never lived on the farm, and don't live even terribly close to the farm. And so they're potentially living in, Wichita or Kansas City or even out of state. We have landowners spread far and wide across the country. And their ideas about conservation and just about farming in general could be quite different than the ideas that a typical Kansas farmer would have in terms of, what kinds of practices you might use, even being aware of the diversity of practices that there are to employ. They may or may not know that, but they may have heard of things like organic or natural, and they may want to know what that has to do with their farms and how they can contribute to perhaps better environmental outcomes.
On the other hand, if you're talking about a landlord who is a retired farmer, they have a greater acquaintance with all of these things. So the dynamics change there.
The dynamics change there, and they might have some very specific ideas based on their previous experience and what they know about technologies, about whether or not they want to implement certain production practices. So there's always this interesting dynamic between the current tenant and their farming philosophy and how that intersects with the ideas and the philosophy of the landowner.
And who ultimately makes the decisions on, for instance, participation in a conservation program or installing conservation practices on a given parcel of land. And you're going to get at that when you put all the numbers together, it sounds.
Right. The big motivator for this particular study was the CSP program, which requires a farmer to enroll all of the land that they operate. And so they actually have to enroll all the ground that they also rent, not just the ground that they own. And that means bringing your landowners on board to the CSP program and the practices that are part of that. And so when we realized that that was a requirement of the CSP program, we started to wonder, well, how easy is it to get all of your landowners to agree to participate in a program like this? And how is that communication working?
Noting that you and Allison are, as we speak, putting together the numbers, and we'll have the conclusions in detail at Risk and Profit Conference. But when it's all said and done, Mykel, how do you and Allison hope that this information will be useful?
What I hope we can do is to help landowners and tenants better understand where the other party is coming from, and maybe develop some strategies for communication that will help them reach a mutually beneficial, a mutually agreeable arrangement in their leasing, so that they are as aware as possible of all their options and can interact in a way that sort of helps them to really get the most out of their ground and still have good environmental outcomes.
And that extends beyond just the conservation side of this, throughout the entire leasing arrangement and all the facets of it then.
Right. And we're always looking for more insights on how leasing arrangements are put together and how those decisions are made. So hopefully we can get some information out of the survey about that as well.
And as for the Risk and Profit Conference, as folks attend that event coming up in August, you would ask producers to bring questions and weigh in on this topic as well during that breakout.
Absolutely. We will have good discussion on this, I think, and it'll be interesting to hear what some of the participants think, about these issues.
Well, they'll be taking a closer look at this in the breakout session entitled The Value of Social Capital in Farmland Leasing Relationships at Risk and Profit. Interesting work, and looking forward to hearing about the conclusions once they come together, and we'll have you back for that at a later time, Mykel. Thanks for now. Appreciate it.
You bet.
Mykel Taylor, agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension. Go to agmanager.info, agmanager.info, and click on the link to the Risk and Profit Conference, which is scheduled for Thursday and Friday, August the 16th and 17th, here on the K-State campus.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you. Next, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, the House yesterday passed by voice vote a motion to proceed to conference on the Farm Bill, which is titled the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018, by the way. The House also passed a Democratic motion to instruct conferees to insist on a 10-year permanent funding for an animal vaccine program. The House bill has permanent funding, but the Senate bill has only an authorization for appropriations on that. The vote was 392 to 20 on sending the bill to conference committee. House leadership also named House conferees on the Farm Bill yesterday afternoon. The Senate must now also proceed to conference and appoint conferees. In a statement prepared for delivery on the House floor on the animal vaccine amendment, House Agriculture Committee ranking member Colin Peterson said that the House bill provides $450 million in mandatory funding over 5 years for programs including the National Animal Health Laboratory Network, the National Animal Disease Preparedness and Response Program, and the National Animal Vaccine Bank. Now, again, the Senate provides an authorization for appropriations, no mandatory funding on any of those. House Speaker Paul Ryan and House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi also named the House conferees on the Farm Bill. Included on that list are Representatives Roger Marshall of Kansas and Frank Lucas of Oklahoma. Kansas City Federal Reserve President Esther George says that compared to the 1980s, the farm economic situation now doesn't look all that bad. There's been a lot of farm consolidation, she says, but banks have been minding their underwriting standards carefully. That said, she added, she did not underestimate the stress that exists today or could come. She told this to an audience of farmers and bankers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City's annual agricultural symposium. As a member of the Federal Open Markets Committee, George says she supports the Fed's shift from accommodative monetary policy to a more neutral stance through gradual increases in the Fed funds rate. While that will help keep the overall economy in check, she acknowledged that it could cause pain in some parts of farm country. Agricultural's role in a global economy, the symposium's theme, is increasingly uncertain, and renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs, and tariffs with China over intellectual property concerns exist. Joe Glauber, the senior research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute and a former chief economist for the USDA, said that the U.S. trade dispute with China could have concerning consequences in the long run. Back in 1973, the U.S. imposed an embargo on soybean sales that only lasted a few weeks, but he notes it was enough to encourage Japan to begin buying soybeans from Brazil and the European Union to institute new supports for oilseeds, policies the U.S. later challenged at the WTO. Brazilian soybean prices, he noted as well, are $60 per metric ton higher than in the U.S. Glauber said if these differentials continue, Brazil producers will have strong incentives to plant more beans and take most, if not all, market expansion expected over the next few years. He thinks this is the real serious thing, as he put it. U.S. producers could receive some price protection in the short term through revenue insurance, since spring price guarantees were set before the trade disruptions caused significant declines in prices. However, says Glauber, if trade uncertainty continues into next year, all bets are off. Since the trade battles began, President Trump has said that farmers would not be hurt. Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue has said an aid package for farmers could be proposed sometime early this fall, after prices for fall crops are better known. While there's talk of helping farmers through the USDA's Section 32 programs to buy surplus commodities, and the Commodity Credit Corporation is a concept that Glauber says he struggles with. He said such assistance would disguise the long-term costs of trade disruptions, even though farm incomes and profitability would still suffer. And there's a bigger risk, he says. Farm profitability is one of the key factors underlying and supporting farmland values. After 5 years of falling farm incomes, Glauber said he's surprised that farmland values have been so resilient. Many bankers at the symposium found the confluence of trade disputes and higher interest rates concerning as well. Next up on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. And handing it off now to Greg Akagi with that. Greg?
Janelle Stegall, a third-grade teacher from Olathe, Kansas, joins us. Janelle, you recently had the chance to be a part of the Kansas Soybean Summer Science Institute at Kansas State University, a very busy time during the month of June. What got you interested in participating in the Soybean Summer Science Institute?
Some other teachers from my school district had been involved in it before and had a great experience and learned a lot, and so I decided that I wanted to see what it was all about.
So during that time, what were some of the things that you learned?
We learned how to teach the national standards using the inquiry-based model and using the soybean as the main model of teaching.
It was also a chance to work with your peers who are a part of this year's program.
There were peers from all over the state of Kansas, from small town Kansas, from larger towns in Kansas, all different grade levels, and we got a chance to discuss and determine what would work best for all kids.
And a lot of the curriculum was focused on the use of the soybean seed.
So we wrote lessons that went in, of course, to the science classroom, but the soybean could also be used as part of your social studies and an economics lesson, as part of your reading, if you're going to read about the soybean, as part of your math, if you're going to be talking about yields and those sorts of things. So we discussed using the soybean not only in our science classrooms, but also in every other area of our teaching.
Are you excited for the upcoming school year to utilize some of the things you learned?
I am really excited. We are, in fact, getting together with some girls in the area who are going to get our lessons all ready to go to get started right away in September with the soybean and teach our science inquiry lessons then. So, yeah, we are really excited to get it going.
So if there's a teacher out there who would have interest in participating in future Soybean Summer Science Institute programs, why should they attend?
Not only will they learn how to teach in an inquiry-based way, but they will also meet a great group of people at K-State who will forever be wonderful resources for them, but also all of the amazing teachers we have throughout the state. I think that's one of the best things that's come out of it for me is that professional development group that I have right within our state that is just a wonderful group of people to go to and get answers and talk with about the great teaching that we're doing, that we learned how to do at the Institute.
That's Janelle Stegall, a third-grade teacher from Olathe, who participated in this year's Soybean Summer Science Institute, as she joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
That from Greg Akagi. Greg, many thanks. We'll be back shortly. This is Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Next for you on Agriculture Today, our weekly horticulture feature. And we have quite a panorama of insects to talk about. Joining us once more is horticultural entomologist, K-State Research and Extension, Raymond Cloyd. And Raymond, we'll start with Japanese beetles. We touched upon those last time, and they're still around, and they're still causing some trouble for homeowners. What's the story?
Absolutely, Eric. Japanese beetles are swarming all over. Basically about a quarter of an inch, coppery colored, and they have about 13 to 14 white tufts of hairs around their abdomen, around the perimeter. No other insect has those characteristics. The adults are just feeding on everything, ornamentals, fruits, vegetables, you name it. And so what do you do now? Well, the only thing you can do is twofold. One is hand pick. But when you're talking about thousands of these, it's not really conducive. The other one is don't use Japanese beetle traps in among your plants. If you're going to use Japanese beetle traps, put them near your neighbor or somebody else, but away from the main crop, and then spraying. The problem is that most of the sprays are like Sevin and pyrethroids. They will kill Japanese beetles, but the indirect effects are on bees. And if you're going to spray for Japanese beetle, do it in the early morning or late in the evening, so you do not directly impact bees with those sprays. 7 is extremely toxic to honeybees and bumblebees and other bees, as well as the pyrethroids like tall star and those things. So spray early morning, late evening, not when the bees are active, and not on flowering plants, too.
In fact, that's important for a number of pests that you might be treating. Practicing good stewardship and being selective with your treatments.
Absolutely. Unfortunately for Japanese beetle, there are no what we call selective materials. They tend to be these broad-spectrum contact insecticides like carbaryl and others that just kill everything. Yeah. And so you have to exercise good stewardship, read the label, and time those applications when the bees are not active.
Tell us about the green June beetle. And you say this is going after fruits, right?
Yeah, the green June beetle, unfortunately, is sometimes mistaken for Japanese beetles, but it's a lot larger than Japanese beetle and doesn't have those white tufts of hairs. But you normally see them flying around turf at low areas like a B-52 bomber, and they run into you. They make a loud buzzing noise. They're not feeding as much as Japanese beetles. They will feed on fruit. We've seen in apples and peaches, things like that. But they're not really directly affecting the turf grass or other ornamentals. They're just more of a nuisance, flying around there, and people get a little upset when these big insects are flying around their yard.
But they can damage the fruit on your trees or garden fruits such as cucumbers and tomatoes and the like.
I haven't seen them too much on tomatoes. We typically see them on fruit trees like apple and peaches. But when you have high numbers of these insects, they'll feed on anything. When they're hungry, they'll eat anything.
And in that case, you treat them again with something of a selective treatment, or?
Well, just like Japanese beetles, Eric, we don't have any alternatives, and so pretty much the materials you would use for Japanese beetle adults is the same what you'd use for green June beetle adults.
Very good. And speaking of beetles, the elm leaf beetle is out, as the name would imply, getting after elm trees?
Absolutely. In fact, the larvae will feed on the leaves, and the adults, they strip them, they make them look skeletonized. And if you looked at the base of the trees, the larvae and the pupa were all gathered around the area. I have an article in our next newsletter on that. You look at those trees, and there's not a lot of green content left. So what can you do? Well, the beetles are now crawling back up to the trees, and you can use a contact insecticide like a malathion or things like that. But again, spray in the morning or late in the evening because those will kill bees that are active, yes.
If you let these heavy infestations of elm leaf beetles go, will they in fact harm the tree for the long pull?
That's a good question, Eric, and probably not. These are large-sized trees, and so they will lose some foliage, but there's probably a lot of storage and energy left to come out with some new foliage. But if you continue to see that year after year, there would be some negative effect on those trees.
And of course, everybody wants to keep the tree foliage intact. We've still a great deal of summer to go, so that's the point in controlling these beetles.
I don't think a Siberian elm with brown leaves is very appealing.
No. Well, these conditions we've had of late are ripe for spider mites. They love the heat. We've had that, so presumably they're out and about in landscapes and vegetable gardens.
Absolutely. Fruits, vegetables, landscape trees and shrubs, herbaceous perennials and annuals. The two-spotted spider mite is a hot, warm season mite, and the conditions we're having are just ripe for reproduction and development. The best way to deal with them is a force of water spray. Blast them off the plants. They won't come back. Soaps and oils will work well as long as you get thorough coverage of all plant parts. And remember, like insects, mites are on leaf undersides. So you have to get the leaf undersides in order to get good contact with these materials.
And those would be the control options of choice as opposed to a miticide treatment?
Well, the homeowner doesn't really have a true miticide anymore. When Calthane was disbanded, it was a relative of DDT. Mm-hmm. The only one left it's called Hexacus, but you can't purchase it by itself. It's in combination. So really, there are no really true miticides anymore available. It's soaps and oils and other types of insecticides that have miticidal activity.
Let's talk about one more bug that's out there, squash bugs. Again, we have brought up before this summer that they are around. They are causing some issues in our vegetable gardens and elsewhere. What's the latest update on those, Raymond?
Well, the squash bugs right now, they've laid the eggs. They're on the leaf undersides. They're red, and they'll hatch into larvae that become gray, and then they'll become adults. And squash bug control with insecticides is difficult because all the life stages are on leaf undersides, and you've got these large cucumber, zucchini, pumpkin leaves, and it's hard to get good coverage. Some people vacuum them up as one. You can squish them. You can apply an oil to kill the eggs prior to their hatching, but it takes diligence. You really have to stay on top of it. I know people that actually carry 32-ounce bottles on their side when they're in their garden, and they spray them with this solution of insecticidal soap. And that seems to work, but again, it takes diligence to do that. So, when you get pumpkins and things like that, very susceptible, you really have to exercise diligence, or when the pumpkins are developing later on, they will start feeding on them, both the nymphs and the adults.
But the cucurbit crops are the most vulnerable to the squash bug activity?
Correct, Eric. Yes,
Much.
correct.
Very good. All right. And to part with this reminder that if anybody has any questions or issues concerning insects in their horticultural projects, be it lawn, be it garden, be it flower bed, Extension is still there to serve.
It is, Eric. We do have individuals' extension appointments to answer questions via the phone or email. Our newsletter is biweekly. Plus our extension fact sheets and information, just get on our website and you should find about anything you'd want.
Entomology.ksu.edu, to be precise, is that web address. And as always, Raymond, thanks for the latest word on insects and our horticultural plantings out there. We'll catch up again soon.
Look forward to it, Eric, as always.
Along with us, Raymond Cloyd, horticultural entomologist, on this week's K-State Horticulture segment. And thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.